everybody.
Hello.
Hello. I hope you are now up and about after some break. So let me start this talk. This is based on a research project that I am doing, which I started like last year, and I am trying to look at fossil fuel subsidies. Fossil fuel is a particular kind of energy which is oil, gas, and coal, and they are found to be very inefficient. They are mostly accruing to the rich people, and they also cost a lot of money to the government. So the G20 group of countries and the APEC group of countries have all agreed to phase out those subsidies. So I thought we should look at how much are the subsidies, what kind of impacts it will have when you eliminate the subsidies, and what kind of impact it will have, and then how do you protect the poor when the prices rise, when the subsidies are reduced. And to do that, I wanted to look at some different country examples and do the study for different countries. When I approached China, they said we are not interested because I am supposed to get their permission first before I start the work. When I approached India, they have been sitting on it for the last 2 years on my request. They keep saying we have sent it to different ministries, this is being discussed and all that, and I don't think I'll get anything from them. And the other two countries on which I am working is Thailand and Indonesia, for which I have already got approval. So let me go, because this is a very contentious issue, very political sensitive issue. I expected that there will be a lot of objection from different countries to participate in this program. Why do governments give subsidies? It's obvious that they try to protect the poor. If you look at these two pictures for India and the Philippines, you can see that the poor people spend much larger fractions of their incomes on subsidies than the rich people. So if there is a price rise, they will be shocked much more than the richer people. So while governments try to protect the poor, these subsidies cost them a lot. And the estimates that are available right now from various sources, for example, which are on consumption subsidies, production subsidies is very difficult to calculate. The consumption subsidies amount to about $500 and above.
This is for India alone?
This is for the world. At a global level, there is about $500 billion of subsidy on the consumption of fuels. And this increased by about 25% over the previous year because of suddenly rapidly rising oil prices, and also because the consumption also was rising simultaneously in countries like India and China, which are growing so rapidly. So when consumption rises and you're going on giving the same level of price difference to them as subsidy, total amount spent also goes up. And this is a very high number, $500 billion. It would have been even higher if some countries had not reformed. And that gives us a hope that some countries were actually able to implement these reforms. The examples here are Ghana, Indonesia, and Jordan. They reduced subsidies to some extent, though not completely. For example, in Indonesia last year, in April, they wanted to increase the subsidies on the motor vehicle fuel, but there were lots of protests all over the country. They kept on trying it for a long time, but ultimately they had to just stop it. And then we had an example from Nigeria that we had talked about earlier, where the government completely eliminated the subsidy. That means overnight the prices were doubled. It was a 100% reduction, increase in prices. So that led to again a lot of riots, and the government had to roll back by 30% or so. This is a graph showing you the fossil fuel subsidies for oil, gas, coal, and also electricity. And if you see on top, we have countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and so on. The Middle East on the whole accounts for about 1/3 of the subsidies globally. And if you look at the average level of subsidies that go to consumers, it's about 75% of the unsubsidized price at the global level. And what are the main issues in energy subsidies? First of all, that it's appropriated more by the richer classes. And if you look at the global numbers, the bottom 20% of the people get only about 8% of the subsidies. And the poor get less subsidy because they don't consume as much of the energy. For example, they don't own cars, they go by public transport, so they don't use so much of fuel. And they don't even have connections to electricity, for example. And they don't have gas connections, so naturally they consume less. in aggregate, although it's a much larger percentage of their expenditure total.
But is like kerosene subsidised? So if people go and buy their little pots of kerosene,
Yeah.
that's subsidised.
That's subsidized.
So they would benefit, even though they don't have electricity or gas connections, they would benefit from the kerosene.
Right, absolutely. That's a good question, and I'll come to that later. What the different sub-elements of these, sub-components of these different types of energy, how subsidies should be seen.
What is the mechanism for giving the subsidy? Is it on the fuel itself, so everybody benefits, or is there a way of targeting those that need it the most?
It differs from country to country. There are different kinds of mechanisms. For example, if the government is buying let's look at oil, for example, it's an importing country. It's importing the crude oil from some other country, it's bringing it to the country, and then it's refining and selling it in the market. So everybody gets at the same price. But if it is kerosene, for example, in many countries, it's available only to targeted consumers, because mostly it's consumed by the poor consumers. So it's available only through some kind of targeting mechanism.
See, the other way is that, for example, if the country say it has a refinery like this talking about, you bring the crude oil. When they bring the crude oil, normally they go through the refinery. When they refine the products, there's always what they call the ex-refinery price, the price that the refinery would place in as a result, taking into consideration the cost of the crude, the cost of refining it, and then the margins. Now, so obviously they have a price they will have to charge for the ex-refinery. But what the government will do sometimes will tell you that at the ex-refinery price, if you're supposed to charge like X Ghana cedis or maybe X dollars, government will say, okay, you charge X minus 2. The minus 2, I'll pay it as a subsidy. So what really goes at the end of the day to the pumps would be minus the 2 cedis for which government will have to pay a subsidy. I don't know why I'm making sense.
Yeah, no, but then it's distributed. How do you ensure that those who are supposed to benefit from the -2 get it, and not the whole population?
You will, sometimes there are some products they call social products. For example, if you take kerosene, which he has given, it's something that is predominantly used by the rural folks. So they know that majority of those products will be moved into the villages. And so that is one area. They may have a product, for example, because of environmental issues. If it is LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, and they know that look, to be able to let people use LPG instead of going for firewood, they would put the subsidy on that. So it's targeted based on the type of product.
And the subsidies also encourage overconsumption, because we are making it cheaper for the people to consume. They tend to consume more than they would have done otherwise. So it encourages overconsumption. And sometimes, because the government spends a lot of their budget on these subsidies, they are not able to spend for other development priorities, like for healthcare, for education, for infrastructure, and so on. So it eats away that amount of budget that's available for those kinds of priorities. Energy subsidies also aggravate environmental pollution, because with GHG gas emissions, this carbon dioxide emissions, so if the consumption is more, the environmental pollution also increases accordingly. And these subsidies also promote cross-border smuggling. For example, my sister used to live in Geneva for some time. She said they used to just cross the border to France, fill the gas tank, the car tank, and come back, because it was so much cheaper there. And it's a big scene.
That's not smuggling,
No,
that's just shopping.
It is very
Smart shopping.
Cambodia, for example, in Cambodia, the oil is much cheaper than in other places. So from there, it goes to Vietnam, Thailand, other places. It all leads up. Sorry?
The example is not smuggling.
Maybe now the things are different. When she was
Yeah,
many
diesel
years ago.
and gas is not the same thing, so there is an exchange between the countries.
It's the same in Singapore. Singaporeans just cross the border to South Malaysia to fill in the gas because it was much cheaper. So now the government has come up with a policy, you cannot come back into the country with a full tank. You can come back.
Yeah, we have policies like that.
We have the same challenging. Our problem, this is very familiar with me, all the challenges of our subsidy. But ours is on an industrial scale. We divert the tankers for supply is all around. So Nigeria supplies most of West Africa, basically, illegally. Because the price differential between the pump price of Nigeria and, say, Cotonou and Togo is huge.
So you can call it smuggling in course even if it is done legally. But actual smuggling also takes place, for example, from Thailand to Cambodia, Vietnam, and other places which are the neighboring bordering areas. A lot of smuggling takes place. So what happens is the government is subsidizing the foreigners in some sense. It's not really subsidizing its own population. Whether it's smuggling or whether it's done because it's cheaper to buy for the people from neighboring countries, it adds to the cost of the government. So what are the barriers to reform of subsidies? It should help people, it should help the country and so on. First of all, there are interest group influence, so there are vested interests. For example, the wealthy population benefit from it more, so they naturally belong to the vested interest group. Then there is the industry lobby because they can get these inputs at cheaper prices. Many of the industries use oil, electricity and so on as inputs, so they also have very strong lobby. And then there are environmental activists. Green energy and clean energy. That they say that if you subsidize energy, then you are increasing the pollution, environmental pollution, because it's creating more emissions. So they are against this. And then politicians, they don't want to lose the votes from the richer classes, from the urban populations and so on. Among the governments, again, there are problems from both importer side and exporter side. The importers are worried that if they keep buying, the governments keep buying at higher prices from the international market and keep selling at lower prices, then it's fine. But if they remove the subsidy, then the inflation will go up because the domestic prices will go up. For exporters, they are worried about export revenue loss. And then there are logistical difficulties, as you can imagine. The users of oil or other kinds of energy, they are organized very differently. So the government has to deal with different kinds of interest groups. For example, the poor people, they lack voice, they do not have the resources to organize together, so they remain just scattered. The production industry, as I was saying earlier, which use gas and coal, they are very well organized and they are very influential, so they do not want subsidy to be even reduced, forget about eliminating. And the distributors also pollute. Plus, within the government, there are several different ministries and organs which are responsible for administering the subsidies. For example, we may have rural governments which are distributing kerosene in the rural areas. You might have urban governments, municipalities, you might have central government looking at some other things. So if you consider the different countries, we find that Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Energy, and the tax bodies, the national planning bodies, they all have different kinds of roles. So, and they do not coordinate very often. So we don't know how much subsidy is going from which part. It's very difficult for the government to then do the subsidy reform. We don't know where the subsidy is coming from. So what kind of campaign one can build to have support for reform? We have to look at the stakeholders on the one hand and the government on the other hand, which also is a stakeholder responsibility. So what we have to do is we have to create awareness, as we all know, and we have to also get the buy-in from all the stakeholders. We can look at it in two ways. We can tell them what the benefits are of subsidy reform. For example, we can talk about subsidy, whether it's reaching the poor or not. That's the ultimate goal of subsidies. On the cost side, we can tell them that it's creating overconsumption, so we might run out of our resources in the future. We can talk about increasing inflation, which affects everybody in the population. And we can talk about rising air pollution, which also affects everybody. And we have to have dialogue with the government. We have to also advise them on how they should do it. For example, the earlier question about kerosene, we can tell them, for example, that you look at different types of energy. For example, if it is kerosene for the poor, you don't touch it, or you touch it the last if you have to at all. You start with the types of energies which are much more regressive in nature, that is, which are consumed much more calories. For example, petrol for car use. You can start cutting that first. And also you should do it very gradually, so that the impact will not be felt by the people. Let's say, consider an example. Suppose somebody is earning $100 and the subsidy is, say, $5. Now if you increase the price by, say, 10%, then they'll lose 50 cents. pay 50 cents extra. So the subsidy will go down to 50 cents. It will not be much for a person who is earning $100, so they may not mind it. So if you keep on cutting the subsidy in very small gradual amounts, it will be much more acceptable, it will be much more easy to implement. And before they eliminate the subsidies or reduce the subsidies, the government should come out with a plan, transparent plan, and talk to the people that we are going to protect the poor. So in fact, they should try to implement some kind of mechanism to protect the poor by providing them transfers. If they already have some transfer programs, then they can strengthen them and start giving out more to the consumers before even they implement the subsidy program. And if they still have savings left from the subsidies after reducing the subsidies, then they can put them for other priority areas like education, healthcare, and so on. The best time for implementing such a reform would be when the energy prices are falling. Like we have been seeing in the last few years, oil prices have been going up and down like a roller coaster ride. So when the prices are on a downtrend, that's the time when if you implement the reforms, it will not impact much in terms of inflation or in terms of higher prices. So ultimately the whole thing amounts to improving credibility and trust in the government.
In Iran, they reduced the subsidies on petrol, and everyone has cars, and petrol costs nothing. And overnight, the government removed all the subsidies and said this was a patriotic thing to do because even Americans had their sanctions, etc., expecting that there would be a patriotic uptake of this. But first of all, people were really angry. They didn't believe the government, and the people that had cars were the middle classes who didn't really trust the government anyway. So that narrative completely got swept away, and people ignored it and started blaming their own government. And then there was a whole black market. What they did was they introduced these cards that you had to go in and show that you bought your gas at the proper prices, etc. So there was an entire industry creating those cards that basically was being sold on street corners. So not only did people ignore the subsidy or ignore the government, but they were also creating a whole other area of corruption. So I think it lasted about 6 months, and then they had to reintroduce the subsidy.
What was the narrative in it?
It was that subsidies were bad because they were actually helping the sanctions, but the government needed money because the American sanctions were hurting the government. So not having subsidies was patriotic. But people didn't like the Iranian government anyway, so they...
Yeah, I think that in Ghana, one of the challenges Ghana has always had is that there's always a contradiction in one breath you're saying that you're subsidizing the product, in another breath you're placing taxes on the product. You see, because you will have your apart from everything, there is some tax component of the that comes. And so people always, and that is the argument. I can imagine myself if I have to argue against the removal of subsidy, that I will have a field day on that day. But the issue is that then you then ask yourself, should government say, okay, let me not take petroleum product is the surest way of getting taxes from the people, particularly in Ghana where, one, property rates are not paid. Nobody even knows what type of property you have, and nobody, because one, our address system in Ghana is so terrible. And so to even trace for that decision. And so one of the most reliable places of getting taxes revenue is obviously through petroleum products. But now the argument is that, look, you are saying that you are subsidizing this. At the same time, you are placing taxes on it. You can have a tax component of about 49%, maybe 40% or whatever. So that is one challenge that government has in terms of trying to take as subsidy. Because since 2009, 2008, we've had this whole idea of an automatic adjustment. Anytime there is an increase, whether it's the depreciation of the cedi against the dollar, whether it's crude price increases or whatever, automatically the prices should change. But we have never been able to effectively implement that because of the fact that we have not been able to get a narrative right. How do we tell the people in the face of all these things? And the other area is also about the transport sector. Sometimes we have our public transport system in this country, particularly the state-owned one, is not efficient. And so we rely purely on private sector to provide us with transport. And so anytime there is an increase in fuel prices, transport owners exaggerate the component of energy cost to their total cost burden. And so you realize that they also increase. it affects food, it affects everything, and it becomes an issue. So I really don't know. It is the best way to go, obviously, would be to take off subsidy and you are free forever. But when you are talking about a situation where in a year you can pay in Ghana, the projection was that if we had not increased fuel prices, the projection was that for 2013, we're going to pay subsidy of about 2.5 billion. Last year, our total oil revenue after everything was about 584 million. So it means that even our total oil revenue that we use in terms of our oil production, the subsidy has consumed everything. So that is the challenge that we find ourselves in Ghana, and how to take out the subsidy because of some of these challenges.
The first point you said that they are subsidizing and they are taxing.
Yeah.
I think they should rectify that by calling the taxes as negative subsidies. Actually, when you estimate the level of subsidy, you should look at how much is the tax, take that as a negative subsidy. And then look at the net subsidy, how much it is. So even if you are giving more subsidy because of tax, it becomes less because you are counting it as negative subsidy. So you have positive amount and you have negative amount. So subtract it.
Subtract it and get the next.
Get a net. That's the way we should estimate subsidies. So when we present the subsidy estimates, they are based on all these components. Even for countries that are exporting, say for example some countries exporting oil, what does subsidy mean? They are not buying from elsewhere. They are exporting what they have. But you should look at the opportunity cost, that instead of selling the same product that they are selling domestically, if they had exported it, they would have got a much higher price. So that's the difference that you look at.
One of the last things on your last slide, I think, said that within the government, there's no clarity on what subsidies exist, right? There was some place, maybe you just said it at the bottom.
So there are different agencies within the government that are responsible for different components.
Yeah. So, but maybe I heard it wrong. But did you say that basically the government doesn't know?
Yes.
But at least there's something that can be found out.
That's
I mean, these are figures in some book. You know, you have to find somebody has figures.
In fact, I wanted to do that because all the estimates that are available from the IMF, from the WEO, the World Energy Outlook, and other things, which are the well-known places from where you get the energy subsidy estimate, they're all consumption subsidies. They just look at what is the price, what's the cost, and the price at which you're paying. They just look at this price gap. There's no simplest approach to get this.
Okay.
Very simple point. But if you want to look at the producer subsidies, for example, the state-owned enterprises, like in China and India, I know that there are lots of state-owned enterprises, they have their own refineries. We don't know how much is the cost to them of producing, how much is the cost of extracting say crude oil, and what's the final amount of expenditure that they incur completely. They may be selling it at a much lower price, and that's why we find these oil bonds in India, for example. That oil refining companies, they are paid the money by the government to sell it at a cheaper price. But those estimates are not available anywhere. Nobody touches the producer subsidy because it's so difficult. No government wants us to do that. So I was thinking of just picking up one kind of energy from each country and looking at this producer subsidy, but we wanted to have data from the government. And because they don't want to share the data with us, they don't want to participate in it.
Who doesn't want that?
The governments. Because it is within, many of the governments have it within their state enterprises. That's why you don't find it any good.
But I was just focusing on India. Like within India,
Yeah.
it must be possible to find out which subsidies and taxes are applying.
That's what I said. For last 2 years, I'm waiting for the Indian government to give me no objection so I can go ahead. So what I started doing is I'm doing a desk-based study of the consumption side subsidy, not the producer side subsidy.
Let me ask you a question. On the power side, in terms of the power side, what are the challenges when you want to take out subsidy, for example, electricity cost?
There, the people are talking about the 3 different stages of the generation, transmission, and distribution. So you have to look at what are the different stages first. I'm not looking at that in this one.
Ah, okay.
Tunji had a question.
Yeah, well, my question was actually.
Even in protest.
Yeah, no.
Nobody wants to.
No one answers my question. No, the thing about it is, all this is very familiar. I'm actually, in a lot of ways, pleased that you're not talking about Africa or West Africa. This also happens in India. This idea of not wanting to share information, or not even having the statistics on output and all of those variables that are important price of gasoline. In Nigeria, of course, the argument is much larger and much more complicated than this. There's no political will in the government, in leadership, because it's a way in which the state organizes itself, the political players and actors. There's no organizational will because NNPC, the state-owned manager of these resources, is also very, very opaque. And there's no public will, for the simple reason that for the Nigerian public, they believe that, subsidized petroleum products are the only benefits they're getting from being an oil-rich country. So there's a narrative and a counter-narrative. Lost in that shuffle is the actual economic logic, which is what they're saying. But that doesn't hold. Nobody, people know. The labor unions are aware of it, civil society organizations are aware of it, but nobody raises that argument because they don't trust the government. So even when the government comes out with a policy, right, in which they're talking about the opportunity cost of the subsidy and the transfer subsidies and transfer payments we're going to make to the public, nobody believes them. And that is really what is missing, the fact that you don't trust your government to deliver. So the argument about people know that the subsidy itself is bad. And what also happened was the unintended consequences of the riots and the public protests a year and a half ago was that the government was now forced to pedal back on the subsidy, and they kind of had negotiated halfway. So instead of perhaps 100% increase in price, or the pump price became 50% increase. But then they now instituted a whole series of commissions, probes, all kinds of things. And we now discovered that a lot of the marketing and oil companies that claim to lift or import petroleum products. We have oil, we have refineries, 4 stable refineries don't work properly. And that's also deliberate. So you now import the oil. They discovered that most of this oil receipts, or most of this payment for oil was for products that were never delivered. Never delivered. And this is to the tune of about maybe $6 billion a year almost. So what has now happened in the aftermath of the protests and pushback, civil society, has been some kind of rationalization of that process now. So whilst last year you had about 174 companies that claimed to be marketing companies, this year is down to, I think, 34.
From what number?
174. So yes. And so and the price has gone down. I think they've saved maybe 1.6 trillion naira. I don't know what that would be in USD. But all of this, the point I'm trying to say is that sometimes economic sense and economic logic is not where the argument is. It's not why people are resisting. It's just that they don't trust the government. And the government can come up with an alternative narrative. There's nothing you tell the public that they'll believe. And unfortunately, the public itself cannot come up with a different way of saying, okay, how are we going to move beyond this subsidy issue, because the subsidy itself is affecting the economy. So it's a very dicey thing. We understand they're planning to lift the subsidy again, but I'm sure there's going to be some political cost to that.
I think you have to tailor the reforms to different countries, to the local situations, to the political systems, and you have to take on board everybody around. Like we were learning earlier that this process, that stakeholder consultation process, might be very long and drawn process. So you may have to change your goals, you may have to think of how to do the subsidy reform. Not like Nigeria, for example, that overnight you want to change it.
I'm told India, this is in India.
This is in Asia.
Okay. Yeah, but I'm told that in terms of taking off the subsidy and allowing the yes, yeah.
Diesel, not on kerosene.
Diesel and kerosene are more targeted towards, or at least they are thought of as
now the targeting there is being done through this new system. We have the Aadhaar card. So straight into your account. So you go straight into your bank account. You're buying at the commercial rate.
You buy at the commercial rates.
And the money comes to your account.
It's a cash transfer.
Cash transfer.
Like Louis was asking the question about whether the price is reduced for everybody or not. But there is this new thing that the Indian government has started, is conditional cash transfer. So the poor people also, the rich people also, everybody goes and buys in the market at the market price. But for the poor people now, they're being linked to the new IT system, to the bank accounts, and in their bank accounts, the money will be directly transferred,
Okay.
cash transfer.
You know, one of the things, one of the challenges is that this subsidy, you pretend that you are putting subsidy on the product, but you end up creating shortages. In that,
That's black marketing.
yeah, even not even because of government. Government then over a period of time will accrue subsidy, how do you call it again? Money that are supposed to be, assuming that you have bulk distribution companies that import finished products into the country. They sell at a particular price, hoping that government will pay the difference. Government accrues this debt, indebtedness to them over a period of time. And they are also running businesses. So you have a situation where they don't even get the money, so they can't go and import the products. So over a period of time, you see that the shortage of the product. And now people then go into black marketing to keep those things. So the same people you want to protect, they end up buying the product even at a price that will be higher than even if you are not serious.
We're seeing the same situation in India also.
Kerosene, the
Private
problem is
companies
that
are not being
kerosene you cannot remove subsidy because it gives you a lot of, they mix with diesel and then use in the motor vehicles. So all this, majority of the kerosene goes into the black market.
In the future, do you see any change?
I think so. I'm very hopeful. I'm very optimistic. I'm a person who is generally optimistic. So, looking at the examples from Jordan, from Bangladesh, and from Indonesia, I think we will be able to make some progress. At least in some countries, if not all.
So there was effort made for diesel subsidy also, removing in India, but then was stopped. The Toya's law has been removed, a lot of protest came, subsided, now diesel is in the market.
We'll do it gradually.
They will do it slowly.
Okay. Other questions? Thank you.
Well,